Hello and welcome to this presentation on 100 years of insulin, assembled by Aberdeen Archives, Gallery and Museums in partnership with Explorathon at the University of Aberdeen. My name is Ken McHardy and I was born in Aberdeen, where I spent most of my working life as a doctor specialising in diabetes. As we approach the 100th anniversary, I would like to tell you about the discovery of the medical miracle known as insulin, which has changed millions of lives across the world. While that is an exciting enough tale for a retired diabetes doctor to tell, it is even more exciting for me to share how not one, but two doctors from my home city became figures of key international importance in the discovery and early use of insulin. Jack Macleod and Robin Lawrence grew up in Aberdeen. Both were educated at Aberdeen Grammar School, both studied medicine at the University of Aberdeen, and as you will see, both went on to make enormous, if quite distinct, contributions to this story. Let me start by reminding you about diabetes mellitus, or sugar diabetes. A central feature is high levels of sugar in the blood. This spills out to produce large volumes of urine and hence causes thirst. Once suspected, the diagnosis is easily confirmed nowadays with simple blood tests. As well as raised sugar levels, there is also abnormal handling of fat and protein. This combination can lead to long-term complications affecting blood vessels, kidneys, nerves, and eyes. The main challenge in managing diabetes is to use a combination of diet, exercise, and medication to keep levels of glucose, the main sugar in the blood, as near normal for as much of the time as possible. Over 450 million people worldwide live with diabetes and all have some problem with insulin. This hormone, made in a gland at the back of the tummy called the pancreas, allows energy-giving glucose to move from the blood into body cells. Most cases are type 2 diabetes, including nearly 8 in every 9 of over 300,000 people in Scotland. Their cells do not respond well to insulin, and although they continue to make some, they may eventually need top-up insulin injections as part of their treatment. Most others, that's over 33,000 people in Scotland, have type 1 diabetes. This condition implies progressive failure of the insulin-producing cells in the pancreas and mostly first appears between early childhood and early adulthood. Insulin is critical in controlling body chemistry. As levels fall, cells are starved of normal nutrition, and the body breaks down muscle to make extra glucose, causing wasting. Eventually, a more dangerous toxic state of acidosis develops, caused by overproduction of ketones made from fat breakdown. I always had insulin available to treat those coming under my care with type 1 diabetes, albeit by multiple daily injection, for insulin is destroyed in the stomach if given by mouth. It is sobering to think that barely 2 generations before I started practicing in 1978, there was no insulin, nor indeed much else, available for doctors to use in saving the lives of those with young-onset diabetes. In 1920, the best treatment was an extremely calorie-restricted diet. The constant torture of near starvation was worsened by weakness and fatigue. The few with enough willpower to tolerate such an existence would soon enough, say months to a few years at most, run out of insulin altogether, resulting in ketoacidosis, coma, and death. A child or young adult developing diabetes back then had much to fear and little cause for hope. Such a dreadful reality confronted an Aberdonian doctor in November 1920, the month in which he turned 28. Robert Daniel Lawrence, known as Robin, was born at 10 Ferryhill Place, Aberdeen in 1892. He attended Aberdeen Grammar School and went on to the University of Aberdeen, where he first graduated M.A. in 1912 on the way to completing a medical degree in 1916. A burst appendix in 1914 marked the beginning of 2 years of ill health and several operations. Nevertheless, he was a successful sportsman, was president of the Students' Representative Council, and won a series of student prizes. In autumn 1916, he began 3 years with the Royal Army Medical Corps, mainly spent in the Indian subcontinent. On completion of military service, he set out early in 1920 to train as a surgeon and, unusually for one from far off Aberdeen, secured a post in casualty at King's College Hospital, London. He did well and next progressed to assistant ear, nose and throat surgeon at King's. That November, when practicing his surgical skills in the mortuary, a bone chip flew into his eye and a nasty infection followed, requiring hospital admission. Things took a major turn for the worse when routine urine and blood tests confirmed the dreaded diagnosis of diabetes. Although his eye improved, he could now only expect to live for a few more years, providing he could tolerate the awful diet. His dreams of surgery were clearly over, and he moved to the less physically demanding specialty of clinical chemistry. He did research leading to an MD degree from Aberdeen in 1922, but as that year wore on, he knew his strength was failing. He resolved to move to the warmer climes of Florence, where he expected to do some private medical practice to supplement his army pension, and to waste away out of the sight of family and friends. If the weakening Dr. Lawrence were aware of word of a new treatment for diabetes coming out of North America, he chose to ignore it, since every such claim previously had raised false hope but failed to materialize. As his physical decline continued, he could not know how the work in Toronto of a fellow ex-Aberdeen grammar boy and Aberdeen medical graduate might yet change his fortunes. John James Rickard Macleod was born near Dunkeld in 1876. By the age of 7, he had relocated to Aberdeen when his minister father was appointed to the John Knox Free Church in Gerrard Street. Young Jack lived in Rosemount Place and became a regular prize winner at the nearby Aberdeen Grammar School. He began medical studies at the University of Aberdeen aged 17, winning further prizes and medals on the way to graduating MB.CHB with honourable distinction in 1898. Macleod had been impressed by the teaching at Marischal College of Professor John McWilliam, a pioneering cardiac physiologist, and so decided on a career in physiology research. Starting with a travelling scholarship in Leipzig, he returned to Aberdeen for a time, then worked for 3 years in various posts at the London Hospital Medical College. He combined teaching with research on circulation, compression sickness, gastric acid, fat digestion, and abnormalities of blood chemistry in various diseases. In the first of many similar ventures, he collaborated with London colleagues in writing a physiology textbook. His early accomplishments in research and teaching led to an invitation to apply for the chair of physiology at Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. Still only 26, he was offered the post, and in late August 1903 set sail for the New World with his new wife, Mary, 5 weeks after their marriage in Paisley. He spent 15 productive years in Cleveland, where his research became increasingly focused on carbohydrate metabolism. He published many original papers, and by 1913, a book entitled Diabetes, Its Pathological Physiology. He was a popular lecturer on both sides of the Atlantic, and in 1914 was invited to talk on his experiments at the British Medical Association meeting in Aberdeen. From 1916 he made important contributions to the World War I effort on nutrition, aviation and gas masks. In the spring of 1918, while completing his new textbook, Physiology and Biochemistry in Modern Medicine, Professor Macleod finally agreed to accept a recurring call to move to the ambitious University of Toronto. Fate had it that this would be where his greatest achievement lay ahead. 2 years after moving to Toronto, Professor Macleod was contacted by a Dr. Frederick Banting, a young Canadian who wanted to discuss a research idea he'd had. Born in 1891 and brought up on an Ontario farm, Banting followed a faltering start at Toronto University by changing to the medical class. The First World War saw his last year of study shortened and final examinations brought forward to December 1916. The graduates were immediately enlisted for military service, and after time in a military hospital in England, Banting went to the front in June 1918. Within 3 months, he had a military cross for bravery and shrapnel wounds which would prematurely end his war action. He returned to Toronto to complete his service, mainly practicing orthopedic surgery in the military hospital. Another year of civilian training in surgery did not get him the surgical staff post he craved. So, in summer 1920, he set up in general practice in London, Ontario. Business was slow, and he took on some teaching to supplement his income. After reading about the pancreas in preparation for a lecture, he came up with an idea that could maybe find a treatment for diabetes. He had almost no experience of the condition, nor had he read much about it, but, as was his way, became very determined on taking things forward. He was advised to meet a world expert in the field, a Professor Macleod, who had recently moved to Toronto. Their first meeting took place a week later, on Monday, 8th November. Banting later complained that Macleod had not initially taken his idea seriously. What is actually more remarkable is that the professor offered the inexperienced and poorly read Banting the opportunity to do some experiments the following summer. Banting joined Macleod's laboratory in May 1921. Macleod discussed research plans with him, demonstrated the surgical techniques required, and gave him a student assistant, Charles Best, who had just completed a BA degree in physiology. Best had been brought up in Maine of Canadian stock and was one of Macleod's brightest students. Best too was inexperienced, but would at least know the laboratory techniques used in glucose measurement. Banting's idea was dependent on the peculiar arrangement of the cells in the pancreas. Most of the gland produces chemicals that drain along a duct into the gut to digest foodstuffs. Small groups or islets of different cells are scattered through the pancreas. It had been suggested that these produced a factor for controlling glucose levels. Banting proposed surgery to tie off the pancreatic duct, hoping the digestive cells would shrivel up. Weeks later, the shrunken pancreas would hopefully be made up mostly of islets from which an extract could be made. Injecting this into a diabetic dog might lower blood glucose. The surgery was complicated, and several dogs died prematurely. Skills improved with practice, and more hopeful results emerged. By early August, injected extracts had lowered glucose levels in 3 dogs. While each dog died within 3 days, Banting was completely convinced he had already found the answer to diabetes. That is, that he had discovered insulin. He likely had not read how other researchers had already got this far. the earliest 15 years before. Nobody had yet produced an extract with reliable effects and low toxicity. Banting and Best wrote excitedly about their results to Macleod, who had left for holiday in Scotland in June. Macleod wrote back describing how repeat studies done more rigorously would be required to ensure the early findings were valid. The headstrong Banting took immediate offence, and from now on grew paranoid that Macleod was trying to steal his discovery. Macleod returned to Toronto and, despite Banting's aggressive disrespect, continued to support the young scientist. The work progressed slowly, not least due to Banting's mistake in failing to notice the extract made on one occasion from a whole dog pancreas was at least as good as that from a pancreas following tying of the duct, then waiting several weeks to let the digestive tissue shrink. This finding meant, of course, that pancreas surgery, and indeed Banting's whole idea, were unnecessarily complex and quite irrelevant to the research. Towards the end of 1921, Banting and Best were achieving little more than keeping a diabetic dog alive for several weeks with extract. This was when the addition of a fourth researcher proved decisive. Bert Collip, a 29-year-old triple graduate of Toronto University and Professor of Biochemistry in Edmonton, was in Toronto on a travelling fellowship. He had experience in making extracts and, using Macleod's advice to work with alcohol extraction, made rapid progress in purifying materials which, by this stage, were all made from fresh whole cattle pancreas obtained from the local abattoir. Banting's paranoia grew with Collip's success. He rushed ahead to give the Banting and Best extract by mouth to a patient in December. It failed completely, and then insisted on it being used for the first injection trial on 11th January, when it had a modest effect but produced a toxic reaction. By 23rd January, Collip's extract was ready for trial by injection, and this time teenager Leonard Thompson was effectively resurrected from a state of near-terminal exhaustion with dramatic improvement in blood and urine tests. This trial and this date mark the real breakthrough made in Toronto. This was the discovery of insulin that would, after all, save the lives of those hitherto dying of type 1 diabetes. Amidst the excitement, there was yet much work to be done in studying the varied physiological properties of the newly isolated hormone, in communicating the results to the medical and scientific communities of the world, and in scaling up mass production in association with pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly of Minneapolis. The wisdom and expertise of Professor Macleod, who had guided and overseen the research from the outset, was of central importance in all of these. Macleod ensured insulin production rights in the UK were signed over to the British Medical Research Council. They sent experts to Toronto and then did their own trials of insulin before announcing its availability in the UK in April 1923. Within a fortnight, Dr. Geoffrey Harrison at King's sent a telegram to his ailing former colleague Robin Lawrence in Italy saying, "I've got some insulin, come back quick, it works." Lawrence was becoming frail and probably within weeks of death. He hired a driver and together, over 10 days, they covered around 1,000 painstaking miles to London. Lawrence had his first dose of insulin on the last day of May. Not only did this save his life, but it gave him 45 more years, which would be largely dedicated to the well-being of those living with diabetes. He conducted numerous experiments on effects of insulin, often on himself. He established a dedicated diabetes clinic at King's with specialist nursing and dietetic input. He published books for professionals and for their patients with diabetes. In 1934, with support from his famous patient, author H.G. Wells, he founded the Diabetic Association, now Diabetes UK, to represent those with diabetes and promote study, education and proper treatment of the condition, encouraging partnership between patients and professionals. The association, for rich and poor alike, aimed to protect social and economic interests and encouraged establishment of self-help groups, today numbering over 400 across the UK. Lawrence presided over association business for more than 20 years, fighting many causes including affordable access to insulin and self-testing equipment and opposing discrimination by reluctant employers. He promoted establishment of links between similar organizations across the world and became first president of the International Diabetes Federation in 1950. Despite suffering a stroke in 1957, he continued to work, publishing his last paper only a year before his death in 1968. His name lives on at Diabetes UK in an annual lecture, in research fellowships, and in a medal awarded to those who have lived 60 years with diabetes. His daughter-in-law, Jane Lawrence, produced a memoir, Diabetes, Insulin and the Life of R.D. Lawrence, in 2012. And Aberdeen City Council have put a plaque outside his birthplace. A truly spectacular payback for diabetes had resulted from Lawrence's last gasp treatment with insulin in 1923. But now let us go back to hear what was in store for the Toronto team following their life-saving discovery. Well, the labelling of Banting as local boy made good prevailed, and he believed it. The myth grew that after his inspired idea, he and his student colleague beat all odds to make the great discovery in summer 1921 while Macleod was absent in Scotland. As explained, the recorded evidence is at odds with this interpretation, yet Banting was lauded as the all-conquering scientific hero and rewarded by the government and University of Toronto. He was given research funding, a non-teaching professorship, and a generous salary for life. After only 2 years in diabetes practice, he gave up the specialty forever. He was, however, determined to make new discoveries, but despite the immense resources put at his disposal, made no further important advances. This was surely no great surprise from the least able scientist in the insulin group. Best, only a student after all, got variable and limited recognition from Banting. Collip incurred Banting's wrath for being unwilling to share details of his successful extraction methods. Saddest of all, Banting and his allies deliberately and successfully sullied Macleod's fine reputation, particularly in Canada. Insulin was such a dramatically successful advance that the Nobel Committee considered its discovery for recognition unusually early. The announcement came in late 1923 that the Nobel Prize for Medicine or Physiology would be shared by Banting and Macleod for the discovery of insulin. They were the only 2 of the 4 to be nominated for the award. Banting, after being talked out of an outright refusal in protest at Macleod's inclusion, shared his prize money with Best. Macleod shared his with Collip. Although substantially overshadowed at the time by Banting's great acclaim, it was Collip and Best who went on to highly successful careers in research. Macleod continued working successfully on many fronts, including research confirming the potential suitability of fish insulin. This is of particular note since his medical school classmate, Dr Thomas Fraser from Kintore, had had a near miss in discovering insulin with zoologist John Rennie when pancreas extracts they prepared from monkfish landed at Aberdeen Fish Market had been insufficiently pure when tried for diabetes at Woolman Hill in the early 1900s. Banting's continuing spite took its toll, and Macleod was pleased to leave Toronto in 1928 when the opportunity arose to replace his former mentor, Professor McWilliam, on the latter's retirement. As Professor of Physiology back in Aberdeen, Macleod continued productive work in lecturing, writing, administration, and in original research, including collaborations with the Rowett Institute and the Torrey Fishery Research Station. Unfortunately, his health declined progressively, latterly limiting work and travel, and in 1935, aged only 58, he died and was buried in Allenvale Cemetery. Professor Macleod's remarkable career and achievements were soon forgotten at home and abroad. It was not until Michael Bliss, Professor of History in the University of Toronto, wrote his best-selling book, The Discovery of Insulin, in 1982, that the truth emerged. He had painstakingly examined documents, text, and lab books, and interviewed some who had memories of working with the main characters. Bliss concluded that all four had come together at the right time to make the discovery, but that Macleod in particular had been unfairly overlooked as a consequence of the pro-Banting campaign. For the next 35 years until his death in 2017, Professor Bliss worked at restoring Macleod's reputation. He had the new medical auditorium in Toronto named for Macleod, saw him inducted into the Canadian Medical Hall of Fame, and delivered many lectures around the world, including on 3 occasions in Aberdeen. He encouraged Aberdeen diabetes consultant Michael Williams to complete his biography, J.J.R. Macleod, the co-discoverer of insulin, in 1993. In 2013, Professor Bliss was delighted with an invitation to perform the official naming of the J.J.R. Macleod Centre for Diabetes, Endocrinology and Metabolism at Aberdeen Royal Infirmary. Diabetes UK have also remembered Professor Macleod, having named London headquarters Macleod House, and by awarding the Macleod Medal to anyone who has lived for 70 years with diabetes. During what would be his final trip to Scotland, Michael Bliss told me it would be up to an Aberdonian, like me, to embrace the forthcoming centenary of the discovery of insulin as an important opportunity to retell the story of Macleod and his great achievements. I am indeed grateful to spread the word not only about Professor J.J.R. Macleod, co-discoverer of insulin and Nobel Prize winner, but also about Dr. Robin Lawrence, first an early British recipient of the life-saving discovery and then a leading light across the world in its use and in the care and welfare of those living with diabetes. Isn't it amazing that the same school and the same university in the same northern Scottish city shaped 2 of the most influential figures in the discovery and early use of insulin?